What would make you fight to block a shipment of cattle? Something as simple as sending animals abroad triggered a huge conflict between Mexican farmers and the United States. But what's behind this decision? What's at stake for those involved? And why now? Let's understand the reasons behind this revolt that halted one of the world's largest cattle export flows. Get ready to uncover the behind the scenes of this story. Hi, I'm Julian Homelo, and this is the Celebrities Farm channel. If you're passionate about stories like this and want to stay updated on everything happening in the rural world, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Join me and discover more about farmers' lives and the stories that often don't make it to the media. In 2025, an unusual movement took over the border between Mexico and the United States. Mexican farmers, united by a common cause, decided to block cattle exports to the US, challenging a billion-dollar market. But what motivated them to take such drastic action? Behind this move, there are issues far beyond the simple trade of animals. The Mexican government, in an effort to strengthen the local economy, implemented stricter regulations on cattle exports, aiming to ensure that the products met international standards. However, many ranchers see these measures as an excessive burden, directly affecting their businesses and the profits that rely on this export. Moreover, the dispute is part of a larger context of agricultural and environmental policies. The US government, on the other hand, relies heavily on this import to meet the domestic beef demand, an industry worth billions of dollars annually. By blocking exports, the farmers not only challenge market policies, but also make a stand against a system they believe is harming their survival in the sector. For Americans, the situation is equally concerning. The US beef market could be drastically affected, with rising prices and product shortages. The economic impact of a disruption in this supply would be immediate, creating a domino effect on the supply chain. However, for Mexican farmers, this move is a way to fight for better conditions and a more secure future for their families and communities. But what's next? This battle over cattle could be just the beginning of a larger fight for autonomy and justice in the rural sector. And what do you think about this situation? Stay tuned for the continuation of this story and see how it might impact the future of agriculture and international trade. The situation we are witnessing is not just about blockades and trade disputes. It reflects deeper issues that affect the daily lives of Mexican farmers and the future of the agricultural sector. Life in the countryside, for many of these workers, is directly tied to cattle production and export. A large part of the rural economy depends on this, with the sale to the United States being one of the largest beef export channels. With the increase in regulations imposed by the Mexican government, costs for ranchers have risen considerably. What started as an attempt to improve market conditions and ensure higher standards has ended up being perceived as a punitive measure for many. For example, the requirement that ranchers follow stricter health and safety protocols, in addition to additional fees, has become an unsustainable burden. For many, these policies were seen as trying to demand more than is possible to give, jeopardizing the sustainability of their operations. Moreover, working conditions in the field have not received the attention they deserve. In many areas, work is hard, the hours are long, and compensation is not always proportional to the effort. The cattle export blockade was, for the most part, a response to these conditions, but also a form of protest against the lack of real government support. To address these challenges, many of these farmers had already begun to see the system as more of an obstacle than an ally. Meanwhile, Americans who depend on Mexican cattle are facing a silent crisis. The shortage of beef in the market, if it persists, could affect prices in ways never seen before. Production costs in the US are already high, and a reduction in Mexican beef supply could further intensify competition for quality products. This would lead to a rise in meat prices, directly impacting American consumers. The issues surrounding cattle export are, therefore, a synthesis of political, economic, and social disputes. Mexican farmers are fighting for their survival, while Americans face a potential supply crisis. This conflict also brings to light the need for a deeper dialogue between the nations. Considering the complexities of a globalized market, trade relations must go beyond mere commerce. They should encompass a mutual understanding of the challenges each side faces. On the other hand, if this crisis is handled correctly, it could open doors for a new way of thinking about trade and international collaboration. This may be the time to find solutions that meet both the needs of Mexican ranchers and the demands of the US market, creating a more balanced and sustainable model. The situation unfolding between Mexican farmers and the US market is not just a reflection of a trade conflict. It reveals the fragility of a global agricultural system that relies on bilateral exchanges but often overlooks local realities. Interdependence between the two countries in the context of beef trade is complex, but it also demonstrates a structural fragility that needs to be understood in its full depth. The first question that arises is, how do agricultural policies in Mexico and the US shape international market behavior? In the case of Mexico, the government sought to strengthen the local economy with stricter standards to ensure that beef exported to the United States met higher quality requirements. However, these standards imposed high costs on ranchers, creating an imbalance between what the government aims to achieve and the ability of local producers to adapt. For many, these high operational costs became unsustainable, especially at a time when international competitiveness requires producers to align their practices with a globalized market swiftly and efficiently. On the other hand, the American side of this equation also needs to be closely analyzed. The United States depends on Mexican beef not only to satisfy a growing internal demand but also to maintain competitiveness in the global market. At the same time, the US beef production system cannot independently meet all the demand. Therefore, the disruption in the supply of Mexican beef is not just a matter of supply and demand but also of established market relations developed over decades. The issue becomes more intense when we consider that the agricultural policies of both countries do not operate in isolation. There are economic and political pressures that directly affect government decisions. In Mexico, the interests of small-scale farmers, who form the base of beef production, often conflict with government policies that favor large corporations and agricultural conglomerates. Similarly, in the United States, the large agribusiness corporations hold significant power, influencing trade policies and foreign relations. However, the difficulties arising from this context can be seen as an opportunity to innovate in the agricultural production and trade model. The cattle export issue can be a starting point for deeper discussions on the sustainability of agricultural trade, considering issues such as rural workers' welfare, environmental preservation, and market access justice. There is also an important component related to the social responsibility of large corporations in the agribusiness sector. If the companies involved in the beef trade had a greater commitment to the working conditions of ranchers and environmental sustainability, it could reverse the current exploitation and imbalance. The transition to a fairer economy, with benefits more equitably distributed among workers and producers, could become a reality if there is a genuine effort to reformulate global agricultural policy. These issues, however, require a closer look at the tensions that exist within a globalized system that often seems more focused on maintaining financial flows than on ensuring social and economic justice. The current situation is ultimately a reflection of the limitations of this model and the urgent need for adaptation. Throughout this video, we've tackled a topic that goes beyond a simple trade dispute between Mexico and the United States. The blockade of cattle exports reveals a broader picture of the challenges faced by Mexican ranchers and the dependence on international markets. It's a situation that puts into perspective the complexities of global agricultural trade and the impact that a seemingly simple decision can have on an interconnected network of production and consumption. So, what have we learned from all this? First and foremost, that Mexican farmers are not just protesting against a government policy, but are also seeking a change in the international trade model. They are calling for fairer, more sustainable conditions that take into account not only profits but also the welfare of rural communities and environmental preservation. This is a legitimate demand that cannot be ignored, as it is directly related to the future of agriculture in Mexico and worldwide. On the American side, the consequences of this disruption in cattle supply are also significant. The beef shortage and rising prices could deeply affect the economy, especially in an industry that is already facing its own challenges. The impact on the American consumer, who depends on this beef daily, will be inevitable. Ultimately, both countries are intertwined in a way that both strengthens and weakens their economies. However, what truly matters is the lesson that this conflict teaches us about the weaknesses of the globalized agricultural system. When public policies fail to consider local realities and the working conditions of producers, the impact isn't limited to farmers, but affects society as a whole. What's at stake here is not just a dispute between two nations, but a reflection on how global trade should evolve, incorporating social justice, sustainability, and respect for the communities that make this system work. The big question is, how far are we willing to change this model to ensure a fairer and more balanced future? The example of Mexican farmers shows us that resistance can be a path to meaningful change, but it's essential for all parties involved, governments, businesses, and consumers, to come together to find solutions that serve everyone. Episode challenges us to think more deeply about the impact of our choices in the world, and how each of us can contribute to a fairer and more sustainable system. We've reached the end of this video, but the reflection on what we discussed doesn't have to stop here. The cattle export blockade between Mexico and the United States has raised a series of profound issues that involve not only trade but also social justice, sustainability, and how agricultural policies impact the lives of producers and consumers. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You are truly committed to understanding the challenges that affect our world. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this dispute? Leave your comment below, telling us what you think could be done to improve the situation for ranchers and ensure a more balanced future for everyone. And don't stop here. If you liked this content, be sure to check out other recommended videos on the final screen and continue learning with us. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and turn on the bell so you don't miss any episodes. Congratulations on making it to the end. You are a person of success. Comment, I made it to the end. I am persistent. I will succeed in life.